I am so excited to introduce this session because this is really an important topic for our community here. This is Susan Stive with Connexion, who's someone our Corporate Alliance Committee has worked with and has helped putting together some amazing programs for a rare community, and Alan Gilstrap from Exia Therapeutics. And I will leave it to you guys.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are the last session before lunch, which is always a hard one when we separate you from lunch. But we will try to make it really innovative and get a lot of good interaction. So just to let you know, we don't have a lot of materials, so we're going to encourage you to ask as many questions as possible because we're representing the industry perspective on collaboration with patient advocacy groups. I'm Susan Stein. I'm the founder of Connexion Healthcare. I've been in sort of the industry world since 1990 and basically have worked either for or with pharmaceutical and biotech companies. And what we do as a company is we actually do medical education. We help build awareness in the area of rare disease and oncology in trying to get healthcare professionals and patients to understand more about diseases and disease therapies. And we work with pharmaceutical and biotech companies. And my partner in crime here will introduce himself.
Good morning, I'm Alan Gilstrap with Exia Therapeutics. Exia is a subsidiary of ISIS Pharmaceuticals, which is an amazing scientific organization. But Exia is a little startup. We're going to commercialize 6 compounds in the cardiometabolic space, and we're focused on rare disease. Formerly, I was at Genzyme with several of my colleagues, and I worked in patient advocacy at Genzyme for many years. So that's basically my experience.
So we wanted to just do a show of hands. Of people in here, how many people work with or are working for industry, so for pharma and biotech companies? Wow, that's great. And how many are patient advocates? And if you can keep your hand up if you're patient advocates that have worked with pharma or biotech companies. Worked with? With, okay, good. Great, so can we just get a little bit of, for the people who have worked with pharma or biotech companies as a patient advocate, does anyone want to tell sort of some of the things that they've done that have been successful in the collaboration?
Here's a hand right here.
Happy to share this information. I love working with pharma. My name's Dina Heath. I work on 2 boards of Amyloidosis Foundation. We work with ISIS, and they have a drug they're working on for us. Working with them by inviting them to support group meetings where they could meet real-life patients with this disease they're working on has been fabulous. In the case of most of them, they'd never met a patient with this protein folding disorder called amyloidosis. It's a fatal adult onset disease, very complex disease, has no medicines authorized for it, only medicines that come from multiple myeloma bone cancer, which gives us some success, but not a lot. Anyway, inviting them has resulted in a whole new perspective on the part of pharma, getting them to understand patients and patients' needs, and they're very excited to come and talk to patients to really get a feel for their quality of life and what their real needs are. The stuff that we see up on the slides all the time is up there. The other thing that's been a big benefit for both foundations I work for is they've begun to fund our projects. And just to give you an example, they have funded an amyloidosis app that I'm working on that will be a clinical resource for doctors when we release it at the end of the year. They have funded our efforts for our FDA meeting that we have next month to present our findings to the FDA on what we need from them. They've funded a new development of the website. Not just ISIS, but all the others are very involved. So it's a very beneficial relationship, mutually beneficial for all of us. So there you go.
Thank you. Anybody else like to share their story of working successfully with pharma and biotech?
I'm with the Batten Disease Support and Research Association, and we're working with pharma on a clinical trial, which the relationship has been wonderful. They're very involved with wanting to know our patients, coming to our sort of patient meeting that we have every year. They want to be involved. They want to get to know the families, not just the ones that are involved, but everyone through the whole stage of the disease. They want to know what's going on.
Did you contact them or did they contact you? How did that initial work?
Um,
We need my husband in here right now. I think the former director and my husband actually met with them at some lysosomal storage disease conferences many years ago and kind of put things together back then, but I couldn't tell you exactly the...
That's okay, but that's another great point of being able to travel around and going to some of these conferences
Other
and
conferences.
meeting people. That's great. Did you have anything else to add?
It's okay. We also have some, as they approach researchers and the researchers bring them back to us as the patient advocacy group, there's a connection there as well. So through our research contacts and as they're approached by the pharmaceutical companies.
Great. Is there anybody here that is a patient advocate that would like to work with pharma and has thought about it, but they're not really quite sure how to do that? And how would you, what is it that you're looking to do?
I just want to say, yes, me. I represent, my name is Lisa Scheuer. I represent RASopathies Network, which RASopathies are a group of genetic syndromes that have mutations on a pathway that, a cellular pathway that cancer researchers know about already. We have targeted medications we know about, having trouble with endpoints. I think a couple of our doctors have tried to work with pharma, and there were sort of like complications between buyouts and meds disappeared and stuff like that. So it was like,
Great.
I'm Janice with the CADASIL Association. Our disorder affects the small blood vessels of the brain and other regions of the body, which leads to strokes, and the patients suffer multiple migraines. My daughter has like 20 migraines out of a 30-day period. And what we've been trying to do is we know the chromosome, we know the notch, we know the gene, we know everything. We just need somebody to help us with the protein. So we just don't know how to go about and meet with someone to help us with that.
Great.
There's 2 seats right here. If you guys want to come on in, we have 4 seats over here, a couple up here, and then a couple back there.
So great, we're going to have about a good 20 minutes at the end of this to ask questions of a panel. And when we're going to bring up here a panel of patient advocacy representatives from pharma and biotech companies, including Alan, to ask questions. So we can ask questions of them at the end. So I just wanted to tell you that. Just to show, this is going to be a very short talk. A little bit about the Orphan Drug Act from 1983. Some of you may be very familiar with it, some of you may not, but I'll just go through it a little bit. And then Alan and I conducted a survey of some of our friends and colleagues that represent patient advocacy at pharma and biotech companies, and we asked them a series of 6 questions. And Alan will go into sort of the results of that survey just to get a better understanding of the industry perspective on collaboration and what we're going through there. So hopefully that'll be helpful, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So, Orphan Drug Act, and again, I will go through this fast, but if you're not familiar with this, in the back of the room is a copy of this presentation, and it has a reference page that actually goes to that. Ooh, very cozy. No, don't do that, everyone will fall asleep. Okay. So the Orphan Drug Act was actually developed or actually passed in 1983 by Ronald Reagan, and he actually wrote the approval of this Orphan Drug Act. And if anyone here, does anybody know why it's called orphan drugs by any chance? Does anybody have an idea of why it's called orphan drugs? You want to answer that? That's exactly true. However, the original reason for calling it an orphan drug is because back into the 70s and the 80s, there wasn't a lot of people looking at some of these drugs for a lot of these indications and for a lot of these rare diseases out there because there was no incentive. So basically, they were never adopted by pharma and biotech, so they were considered to be orphan, and that's how the term orphan drug came out. So that's just a little bit trivial. And the goals were obviously to stimulate drug development, to benefit the patient community, and also to reduce the time to commercialization, and that's actually a really big one, a really big point. So some of the incentives for pharma and biotech companies to develop an orphan drug, and again, this is all part of the act and all part of the pressure that all of you or the people who have walked your path before you back in the 70s and 80s put so much pressure on Congress, and so that's why this was all developed. So you stand on the shoulders of great people who really helped to put this through. So tax credits for research expenses, that's something that's very big. And remember that for pharma and biotech companies, they are used to developing drugs for large chronic diseases with a lot of different patients in it, and they can recoup their expenses fairly quickly. And I'm sure you all know it's very expensive to develop a drug. But for the orphan drug groups, I was sitting in the, I don't know if the woman's still here, but right before this actual workshop was a woman who said her daughter was the only documented case. So it's very difficult to develop a drug for one person that we know of, right? So there has to be some incentives for pharma and biotech companies to be able to recoup their costs for that. So there's exclusive marketing, which is another big piece of that, very big piece of why pharmaceuticals do this. Pharmaceutical companies actually develop orphan drugs is because of the exclusivity. And exemption from user fees. It costs about $1.5 million for a company to actually just, and a user fee to start to develop a drug. So that is actually waived for pharmaceutical and biotech companies that are actually putting together orphan drugs. And a lot of extensive and timely guidelines for this. So the options that can speed approval, I won't go through this, they're all, you can see it in the references. Basically, all this is a lot of different ways and a lot of different subsets of ways to speed up the market and speed up the development process. So fast tracking, accelerated approval, priority review, and basically if you can show that you have a orphan product or something that is under 200,000 people in the United States and there is no other therapy for it, then you are eligible for any of these processes. Benefits to the patient are fairly big ones. One is that there's a very increased interest in the burden of disease by regulators, pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies. There's a big increased opportunity to have a seat at the table, and there's decreased drug development time. So you can see this actually prior to the year 1983, there was about 34, 38 drugs that were actually approved in the orphan drug space. Since the Orphan Drug Act, there's over 450 drugs that have been approved in this space since 1993. Approximately 15 per year. And you can see in here how it kind of goes up, but that's because it takes so long for drugs to actually be developed that we're just sort of catching up to that right now. As of 2013, you can see that the majority of the drugs are in development, have been approved, are in cancer, genetic disorders, and blood cancers. Other. That's kind of where they tend to lie. Don't try to do the math here because there really has been, there's a lot of these drugs have multiple indications, so it's a difference in the math here. And then obviously I think we've heard a lot about this. I won't go into this too much. We've heard a lot about this. It's going on. Some ways to improve the development and access to drugs are genomic medicine, personalized medicine, targeted treatments, and the influence of the rare disease community. So everyone here in this room and in this entire conference has had a big influence on how quickly we can get some of these drugs to market. And that's what we want to talk about a little bit more today, is how do we collaborate even better, and how do we actually get more of your voice heard at the beginning and early on and often. So early on and often collaboration, that's what really we're looking for.
So Susan said that to prepare for this, we wanted to hear from some of our colleagues in the industry as to some of the things that they've done and some of their thoughts on how best patient organizations can work with them. And I know that there are several patient group leaders in the room, and some of you may have experienced some negative experiences with some pharmaceutical companies, but I have to say that this statement is very true. The majority of the people that are working in this space want to help you, and they want to do well. So let's just keep that in mind as we go through. Next slide. So the first question that was asked was, briefly describe your role. And every single respondent said that they are responsible for relationships with patient organizations. Some of us have also responsibilities for scientific exchange in really creating pieces that help talk about the disease, help educate about the disease, and other types of material like webinars, so disease education. And then others in the respondents have responsibility to ensure that the patient voice is understood at the boardroom table as decisions are being made. So my responsibility is really, and my goal is really to help each one of my colleagues understand what the daily impact is on patients that are living with the diseases that we're focused on. And as we're making decisions, there's a balance between the needs of the business and the needs of the patient. And that balance should always be considered. Okay, next slide. The next question was, what recent changes seem to encourage this industry to develop therapies? So as you can see, awareness of some of the things that Susan just pointed out. What are the needs within the rare disease community? What are some of the benefits to industry from a regulatory standpoint and from a funding standpoint that can help us develop therapies to address some of the needs that exist. And that, again, is the precedent for business success. I came from Genzyme, like I said. Genzyme was one of the early innovators in this industry that really paved the way for rare disease innovation. And then advances in science and technology, really, we're learning so much more that's making it easier and easier and easier for some of those diseases and some of those conditions that in the past were not able to be addressed. We're starting to able to understand and maybe address those a little bit easier. And then changes in regulation. I think we all work in a regulatory world, so some of the changes have helped the rare disease space. And so now the next questions really come, I think, and really the informative questions and really why we're here, and it's going to lead our conversation over the next few minutes. What are some of the ways that this industry and patient advocacy groups partner best? So really understanding, again, what the daily challenges are of living with that disease. We're being held accountable when we take an experimental therapy to the regulatory agencies. Not only do they not only want to understand what are the clinical improvements, but the regulatory authorities are also, and payers most importantly, are very interested in how does this experimental therapy improve the daily functioning of the patients in this trial. You can help us understand that. Sharing information for disease awareness, policy and access issues, registries, patient databases, and clinical trials, clinical trial accruals. When patient communities educate on the daily challenge of living with the disease, how many of your physicians that you see, the specialists that you see, don't fully understand the full impact that disease has on you or your child? That's part of our concern, is to help not only educate other industry partners, but also educate the physician base about what are the daily challenges and how can we best address those daily challenges together. And then when patient communities collaborate on educational pieces, and then something that's becoming really important is patient-reported outcome tools, or PRO tools. Question number 4 was, what is the best way for patient advocacy groups to form relationships with industry? First of all, be open-minded and be flexible. Have clear and realistic expectations up front. Remember to understand that there's a balance on our side, balance between the business needs and the needs of the patient community. Maintain a transparent and a mutual respect from one another. Sometimes those business needs can get, can tip the scale for us, and we need to have a transparent relationship so that, my patient leaders that I work with, I say, look, if I ever overstep the bounds, please tell me. Please be upfront with me. But let's partner where we have common goals and common objectives. That's the place we'll partner. Face-to-face meetings are, in my book, are crucial because it helps build trust. You can talk a lot over the phone, but there's nothing like a face-to-face meeting that helps build trust. Share communications prior to distribution. So that goes both ways. Help us understand what's coming. And my patient leaders understand if I know that there's a clinical trial that's being published or there's information that's coming out, I'm going to do them the courtesy of letting them know, look, this is coming. I can't tell you until it's published what it says, but just know that this is coming. And then as soon as it's published, I will email you a copy immediately so you have it first. If you're a patient within a patient organization, give the foundation the respect of letting them drive the communication for the foundation. I've seen it be very disruptive when one parent takes on the role of communicating to the community when they're not a part of the leadership of the foundation. That's a challenge, and that causes a divide in the community. And I want to be a part of helping the foundation and ensuring that the foundation is the credible place to go to. Identify the gaps and helping industry fill those gaps. So understand the needs. If you were in the conversation earlier, there was a mother that said that the researchers did not understand what her motivation was for this treatment. And in a conversation with 2 parents, this researcher asked the question, if you could have one improvement in your child, what would it be? And both mothers simultaneously said, speech. And that was not the direction that the researcher was going. And she said within 6 weeks, it's changed every part of that research. And for a parent to be sitting in front of a world-renowned researcher at a world-renowned institution and to have that power, it's incredible. Your voice is incredibly powerful and important in this entire process, not only for researchers, but also for industry. And then the last question is, how is your organization working to make therapies more accessible to patients? Listening. Engaging patients and groups early and often in the clinical trial design and recruitment. Very important. Developing treatments that address unmet medical needs. Implementing a company-wide copay card that eliminates brand-specific cards. Using our website. Conducting trials during launch preparations that allow early access and also compassionate use. And then providing financial and psychosocial services programs for patients and caregivers. Some diseases have tremendous psychosocial challenges, and I think that's part of our holistic approach to helping the rare disease patient communities providing those services. So now what we would like to do is just have a panel discussion and allow you to ask questions.
And we'd like to invite Joanna to our panel. So I'm going to moderate the panel, and Joanne will introduce herself. But I'm going to moderate the panel, so we'd like to have as many questions as possible. This is your opportunity to ask as many questions as possible. I think it's really important for not only the people who are in industry in this room to understand what is needed for successful collaboration, but also for each other to understand what has worked for you, what hasn't worked for you, what are some of the questions that you may have in working with industry, and how, you know, if you have some pearls of wisdom for people internally, and also some pitfalls. You know, what is it that hasn't worked well for you? So first, I'd just like Joanne to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Joanne Vanek. I'm with Janssen Scientific Affairs, which is a division of Johnson & Johnson. I've been in an advocacy role for about 5 years. I was an oncology nurse prior to coming into that role. And before I say anything, I just want to say I wish I could bottle up everyone and take you to my corporate office, and so they could see, hear, feel, and touch all that you do. This is my second year coming to this meeting, and I am so humbled by all that you do, and I mean that sincerely. So keep doing what you're doing. But just real quick, if I can, I've been with Johnson & Johnson for 17 years, and most of that time I spent as a medical science liaison. But about 5 years ago, or maybe it's longer than that, but we had some challenges and safety issues with one of our products. And the FDA kept coming to us as a company saying, okay, what are you doing? What are your advocates saying? And the reality was, we didn't know. We didn't really have a relationship with the advocacy groups at that point in time. Our sales and marketing teams did to an extent, because that was in the days of unrestricted grants, and you know all the challenges that have now come about. But we really didn't have that relationship, and it was because of that safety issue that you know, we said we really need somebody from an industry perspective to be in this space, to really have the relationships with the advocacy groups, know who they are, where their focus is, what their strategies are, and how we can partner. So I throw that out there just because I think that this is an environment now that we all are very, very much in tune from an industry perspective.
So interesting. We were talking prior to this meeting, obviously, and Joanne had mentioned that I think she's going to see her husband, I don't know, somewhere in the middle of the month for about 15 minutes. So you may want to discuss some of the things of why you're traveling so much around people.
Yeah, well, in my role, obviously, I work with the groups, and Alan said face-to-face interaction. You know, I'm probably old school. I can't email. I mean, I email and I do all that I need to, but at least one time I need to put a face to a name. Mm-hmm. And I know that's not always easy for you all, but it's a lot easier for industry. So, you know, you can really insist on that, mm-hmm. or really kind of push that, because for me, it promotes accountability, ownership. So I do go to the patient meetings, to the educational sessions and forums and things like that. So I do believe that that really is a big piece, and I don't think you can ever minimize that face-to-face interactions.
And also, Alan, one of the things we were talking about too, John Spot, is you know, we were talking about a film that Alan was putting together, and the impact that it had by bringing colleagues from Exia to that, and how it just changed their perspective. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, we were in a home of a patient in New Hampshire, and my colleague, there's only 8 of us at Exia, so there's very few of us, but she's new to Exia in a marketing role. It never had previous contact with patients before. So I took her to this filming where we're taping a patient's story all around disease. And the wife was just talking about the fact that she lives daily not knowing if she'll have her husband tomorrow because he lives with the disease. And she was crying, and she was telling her story. And I looked over at my colleague, and she was crying too. And I told the wife later, after my colleague had to leave, I said, you know, you changed her life. She will not approach her job on Monday morning like she approached her job yesterday. And as a patient advocacy person, that is one of my goals, is to give my colleagues a motivation for their job beyond the credit that they get at work, or the pay that they get, or the title that they have. I want them to understand that their role, regardless of what it is in the company, their role has a part in improving the lives of people. And if they can connect their job to a name of a patient, then I've done my job.
So I'd like to open this up to some questions. Can I grab your microphone? Sure.
When there's a generic drug that's an orphan drug, and so it's used for an off-label indication, how do you motivate the pharma companies when there's no pot of gold at the end unless you can combine drugs or make a different dosing, or so what? That's where I am with the liver condition my daughter has. We have an awful, and it works for her and she's fine, but there's other kids around the country who can't get it.
Great question. Want me to take this? It's a challenge. The reality is, there isn't a pot of gold at the end of that. So I think it's a lot of times just through persistence that you have to keep going, and not so much for a product, but I actually developed a online web resource within my company, because actually one thing I found when I took on this role is that in all your organizations and what you do, you have tremendous resources and capabilities, and the average Joe doesn't know about them, including the healthcare provider. I mean, it's amazing to me, the physicians, the nurses that are taking care of you, your loved ones that don't know the resources. So I wanted to develop a one-stop shop, so to speak, just to make it easy that we can list some of the resources that are available for patients. Totally unbranded, no company logo. And I cannot tell you the number of times I get, Joanne, this is great, and it's user-friendly and it's got all these things, but what's the ROI? Well, I was an oncology nurse. I didn't know what ROI was, But,
Yeah.
return on investment. So my response is, it's the right thing to do. And you just have to keep, just like you have to keep pecking away, we do too sometimes.
Do you want to tell people what that great, the .com?
Oh, okay. The resource actually is advocacyconnector.com. If you go to www.advocacyconnector.com. And it's primarily in oncology, although we do have some immunologic diseases. We have a rare disease, Castleman's disease is in there, and a few others. And again, it's a resource which really helps all of your organizations. We list them and all the resources that are available, so a patient can go in there and say, I have Castleman's disease, I live in the state of Georgia, and I'd like some national as well as local state resources in the areas of, and there's a laundry list, if you will, of 26 different capabilities. And you can check financial assistance, which, no surprise to anybody, is the #1 requested resource. Caregiver support and clinical trials are second and third. So I think that those really, telltaling what those are. And then you can go in, and a number of advocacy groups that are in that space are listed there.
Great.
I don't have all the answers, but I can connect you to a patient organization that has dealt with that very issue. I'd be happy to connect you.
Hi, I'm Andra Stratton with Lipodystrophy United, and I have worked now with 5 different pharmaceutical companies, small and large, and I've had mostly great experiences. I believe that no patient description is complete without the patient's story, and so the way to do that is to share it, particularly with pharma. So I'm pro-pharma, but working with pharma, but there have been some negative experiences that I've had, and I feel a responsibility to, as the leader of the community, to protect them. So, and the experiences really can just depend on the policy of that particular pharmaceutical company. I mean, some companies really have gotten this advocacy down, and I think other companies do it because it's the newer thing to do, and they're supposed to do it, but they don't know how to do it well. How do patients, when they're starting that relationship, how do they create boundaries? How do they ensure that they are protecting the community? And just for an example, in a release form, if you're going to share your story, how can I ensure that if I'm endorsing that the patient speak with a company, that they're going to be protected and their story is going to be protected if something goes wrong? What's your advice there?
Did you want to go first?
No.
Okay. Actually, that's becoming more and more common that because of compliance and regulatory, we do have a lot of firewalls that are built in that, we're very, very careful about what we can say and can't say. When we launch a new product, something is what I think is simplistic as a press release. I cannot send the entire Word document of the press release. I can only send the link to an advocacy group and say, this is, this has just been announced. Now that you can in turn, call me and we can have discussions. We can set up and get a science liaison or, provide some education. But there are very stringent firewalls that are up there. Sometimes I think, and I'll put on an advocate hat, sometimes I think they use the CIAs and the regulatory as a bit of a crutch of not doing things. But I think you just have to kind of, be persistent. The one thing also that I would say is that if you're reaching out to industry and it's one of your first times, so to speak, I would do my homework and really make sure that you know the company. And for J&J, I mean, we have a credo, and the first line of the credo is, for our patients, our responsibilities to our patients. It's a document that's been around for 70 years, and, it comes alive all the time. Knowing those things and, really working that into your story, so to speak, I think are really important. So, again, I think a lot of the firewalls and some of the things you hear are legitimate, but, you're pretty savvy enough to know when you can kind of push the envelope, and we're very careful about, if you say, I don't want this to go, only internal or branded. A lot of our ambassador programs that we have where we have patient spokespersons, we're actually just starting that we have a third party that actually works with us, and everything is vetted through them. I mean, we can't even ask a question without it being through regulatory and compliance. So, it's almost to the extreme, but I think you're going to be seeing that.
Do you want to explain real fast what a CIA is?
CIA is a corporate integrity agreement that has been instilled on a company because they've either, done something, say, maybe promoted off-label, and so a lot of times it's a number of years that they're under this agreement and they're audited frequently. I would say the majority of pharma probably has a CIA of some sort. I don't know, yours is a new company, maybe not, but that's fairly common.
It's also important to understand that the larger the organization is, the more compliance levels there's going to be. So I agree 100%. Study the organization you're going to work with, know the personality of that organization and the individuals that work there. That will tell you a lot about the organization. But also, I would encourage you as a patient group leader, and for you to understand how important your voice is, and to have the courage to say to that organization, I don't feel comfortable with this, and this is why. I know a lot of times patients feel compelled to do whatever a patient, an industry partner asks of them, because there's a potential treatment out there, and there's a potential clinical trial. And sometimes I think if I were a parent or a patient, I would feel like, well, if I just did this, I might get in the clinical trial. But have the courage to say no. I don't feel comfortable with what you're asking me to do.
This is sort of a brass ring question. That may not be the time. I think we all understand about patient family-centered care and everything, and we've talked about all levels. Now to the next level, is it possible to consider for advocacy organizations to be at the table for intellectual property?
I'm sorry.
For intellectual property.
So,
You can take that. I work for Big Pharma.
yeah, for what purpose? Yeah.
The results of the fruits of the intellectual property of the
So
drug.
you,
Yeah.
So in my experience, patient organizations do benefit because I'm a partner at the table with them on projects, on funding, meetings like this. A lot of pharma companies have contributed to the financial aspects of this meeting. So you do benefit, and there's a treatment at the end of the day. So as far as an investor in the organization as part of that, I mean, that's between you and your financial advisor, but I think that's a question to ask for the partners you're working with.
Yeah.
That's a hard question.
We have another question back here.
Hello. I have a question about the patient-reported outcomes. We are talking all over during the meeting about bringing the patient voice into the drug approval process. Are the pharmaceutical companies taking the time and the investment to develop those methodologies and tools and bring the patient voice into the drug approval process based on sound science and not anecdotal stories that are very, very important, but you need the sound science?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. A couple of the buzzwords, and at least within J&J, patient engagement, patient centricity. You're going to hear a lot about value-based medicine, quality, real-world evidence. We're doing a lot of work with various advocacy groups on their registries, having a part of their registries, being able to provide some questions to them. They provide us with some of the trends that are out there. So, I mean, it's really a strong collaboration. The other piece is, we're all here, or you're all here to represent your various groups. At least I find sometimes it's very difficult to find patients that are willing to come forward and to have a voice. We're always looking for patients. We're always looking for patients to communicate their stories so they can tell us what were the challenges, what are the gaps. We have focus groups that we put together to try to get to those. So I think, one thing I didn't mention, sometimes it's just finding that one person within industry, an organization that will connect the dots for you and help. But for the most part, and I know that everybody operates a little bit differently, but for the most part, there will be real collaboration that we want to hear the patient stories. We want to engage them. We want them to have a seat at the table. We now are just getting to the point, we're a little bit behind, but we have advocates at our clinical trials, and when we're developing the studies, we're just beginning to have patient representatives on those panels. And we don't want the same ones over and over again. So, we really need to hear your voices.
Can you just, I'm sorry, just on the clinical trials, because I was going to ask that question, can you just go on as to why that's so important?
It's funny, when I first, when I worked as an oncology nurse in every clinical trial, I did a lot in clinical trials, but I always looked at them and read them with the eyes of a nurse. I mean, I wanted to know the science, but I really wanted to know the infusions. How long was the patient going to be sitting in the chair? Were they going to be shaken and baking because they had a monoclonal antibody, and what was the regimen? And, what was missing was the patient. We never had the patient. Even at patient conferences that I go to for other organizations, I'm always amazed that the last session is usually the one with the patients. I don't know why that is, because to me, if it weren't the patient, you really wouldn't have anything. So I do think it's really important that we have seen that the patient brings that perspective. What we take for granted, an 8-hour infusion, somebody's at a major academic center and they've got to bring somebody there, or if they park their car, if you're in New York City, it's $70 to park your car all day. So, I mean, it's the patient perspective that is really important, and we do include that now and get them to read the entire protocol. And like you, they're humbled at the knowledge level that you all have and what you can provide.
If I could just make one quick comment as well. I'm Dan Leonard from Genzyme. So the path to a patient-reported outcome tool is actually a study in and of itself oftentimes. And so we have folks now that are dedicated to running those studies, the hope to get to the point where you have a patient-reported outcome tool. And we've gone through patient organizations to find people to do those studies. They're basically surveys that you can do over the phone. And so there's a collaboration that can happen between industry and patient organizations to get to patient-reported outcome tools that I think is really important.
So if you're a pharmaceutical company, you have a drug that it's going to be approved or not approved, but let's assume that the drug is approved for your indication. Are you bringing the patient-reported outcome, the voice of the patient, during the clinical trial as data for FDA to review?
That's ultimately the
Okay, thank you.
The FDA is requiring that. They want to know, not only does your drug, your experimental compound, change clinical numbers, but they also want to know that it's improving the daily life of that patient. So to understand the challenges that a patient lives with on a daily basis, we have to either do a PRO tool or ad boards. There's a lot of techniques that we use, but a PR2 is the most effective because it, like Dan said, it's a clinical study. It's a study.
Question back here.
Hi, mine's less of a question, more of a comment. I'm not on the industry side, I'm also not on the patient advocate side, but I'm from a company called MediKids, so we kind of create superheroes and comic books to explain diseases to kids, and I've had a number of discussions with a lot of industry groups, but also patient advocate groups that are in the room, and I think, you know, I've been with the company for 5 years, and can I just say how amazing it is to see the shift in mindset of big pharma, from kind of what is the ROI to how can we help the patient, and how can we, you know, as MediKids, empower and educate young children who are living with life-threatening diseases. And so I would just like to say kind of hats off to pharma for kind of supporting patient advocacy groups, but also companies like us.
You know, if I could just comment, it's funny, we were talking a little bit earlier, I've been in this role for 5 years, and I have seen such a shift. I'm an N of 1, and I represent all of Janssen, so I have about 8 products. And honestly, I was telling Alan, I work remote, but if I go to the home office, I kind of have to put my head down because people know that I love my job. I have the best job in the world. And honestly, it's really growing in industry that we realize the importance. And I think pharma, to your point, gets it. So there's been a big shift in the mindset.
So just to go off of what Dan said in patient-reported outcomes, the Duchenne community, my group specifically has worked just recently with pharma and with the FDA on a patient-reported outcome project. And I think what was important for us was to identify what was important for the patient, because it wasn't necessarily what the endpoint was that was described in the trial. When we went and we talked to the patients, it was actually that the children in our trial were able to maintain some independence. And that independence didn't necessarily show up in the 6-minute walk test. So there are sensitivities in patient-reported outcomes that can come out. And the key is to not only identify what's important to the patient, because that's what the FDA wants to hear, as well as the quantitative data that they're going to bring to the table from the sponsor. But they want to know what's important, what is the most important thing to that patient, how it affects their daily life. And it's important for us as a community to identify that, but then to also try to find a way to quantify it. So that was a little bit of a challenge for the Duchenne community. I think we nailed it, and we'll know, hopefully, if we get a drug approved. But in the meantime, I think it's an important tool. Work with your pharmaceutical companies, work with your community to identify what's the most important part of it, and then, you know, really hone in on those sensitivities, because that's what the agency wants to hear.
So, quick question on that. From the people who represent industry in the room, does anyone else have another story that's similar to that? Because I think that comes up a lot as endpoints that scientists think are important early on in clinical trials that really, when it comes down to it, are not so important to patients, or are important but aren't maybe the number one importance in patients. And I think IV infusion, things, there's so many examples that are like that. And that's why patients are so important and patient advocates are so important in developing trials that really produce a product that benefits the community. So I don't know if anybody has anything that they want to share about that.
And I don't know a whole bunch about our child, but one of the components is our kids have Batten disease, and a lot of them lose their skills, lose their gross motor, fine motor when they're about 3-4 years old. And our pharmaceutical company has taken and graphed what these kids look like on a graph when they start to lose everything. And so now they're seeing that these kids are not losing their skills with the clinical trial going on. So that is something kind of similar.
Yeah.
Natural history, yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's going to bounce around depending on the child.
Good. I think we only have a room for a couple more questions. Does anybody want to ask? Yes, sure.
So Cindy Luxhoy-Hahn, I'm with the Alagille Syndrome Alliance.
And I love your shirts. I saw you come in this morning.
Thank you.
Nice job.
Our question is, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this without, there's a lot of confidentiality kind of things going on. Okay, so basic premises that we have a drug in clinical trials right now. There is, there are some endpoints that were identified, and the reality is that this drug is making an amazing difference for some of our patients, some of our families. Just like life-changing. However, the results of the study, the clinical trial, as far as numbers and p-values and efficacy, are not bearing that out. And so what we are facing is the possibility that our families will not be able to get this drug because the pharmaceutical company will stop. They'll just stop the study and they will ditch the drug. So what are our avenues? What should we be doing to bring to the forefront the results, the reality for our families, to present that and say, you can't do this. We have to have this drug.
The thing that I thought immediately of is the Vertex situation, where they had a drug going before the FDA, and members of the review panel said moderate improvement over what's currently out there. But a man stood up and said, this drug has changed my life. This drug allows me to live a life that I never thought I would have, regardless of what the numbers say. That allows me to live my life. And the drug got approved. This was in the last 6 months, so you can go back and search it out. But I would say make sure that the patient, the organization that is doing the trial understands intimately the improvements. So I know there's an example of another patient organization that videotaped children doing things that they never thought they would do and posted it on their webpage, and the whole world saw it. So
we are out of time.
Oh,
go ahead.
If I can
Sorry.
just add real quick, I think that really just validates the point too of, advocacy being at the seat of the table when these trials are being developed, so you can have a voice of what the outcomes, what's being measured, the quality of life issues.
Yeah, and actually we were. We were involved in the protocol development and actually even the tool that was being used to measure results, but it's just the reality is not coinciding with what they're seeing in the numbers.
help them understand.
Yeah, keep chipping away.
Thank you so much for joining us. And
Thank
special
you.
thanks to
Can we give a round of applause to Alan, Susan, and Joanne, please?